Hello and welcome back to Favorite Things. I'm Dan and I thank you again for joining me here. In previous videos, I talked about my favorite watch, the Rolex Explorer. And I also was not shy about some of the minor criticisms I've had about this particular model, the 114270. But after having worn it more and more for these last 4 years, I not only understand, but I also embrace some of these same details. In other words, I was totally wrong about a few things. So in this video, I'm going to reveal how I've rethought some of those same criticisms. So let's check it out. I'm sorry, buddy. I understand you a lot better now. Let's start with the dial texture. Ordinarily, I prefer a matte black dial. The smooth black surface is legible and unpretentious. And I was initially a bit disappointed that after a short stint with the satin, not quite matte, black dial on the 39mm 214270 Explorer, the glossy dial returned in 2021 with the 124270. However, I now appreciate the deep black glossy dial of my older 114270 and understand its design and functional benefits. Unlike the matte black dial, which often looks gray due to the diffused reflection of light, the glossy black dial is like a black hole and absorbs color and looks absolutely black from all angles, which makes it very legible. At this point, I want to address Rolex's tradition of not adding anti-reflective coating on the sapphire crystal. I think the designers at Rolex prefer the jewel-like sparkle that you get from a highly reflective sapphire crystal. So it may have been an aesthetic reason more than anything else, but that's just a theory. Next, I want to address the applied markers. Yeah, in general, I prefer painted numbers as they have a more vintage tooly vibe and less blingy than highly polished white gold markers in many luxury watches. However, when I see the dial from an angle, which is much of the time, I see the subtle reflection of the marker frames that perfectly match the edges of the minute and hour hands. In fact, it's visually more consistent than the design of the iconic 1016 model, which has a bit of a mismatch between the painted markers and the high polished frames of the hands. I have been catching myself admiring this detail more and more. The non-lumed numbers. This used to be my biggest complaint with the 14270 and the 114270, but now I get it, and no, somebody from Rolex didn't have to explain it to me. I figured it out all on my own. Let me explain. One of the many things I prefer on the 114270 over the new 124270 is the slightly more subdued and finer sized markers. The classically sized 3, 6, and 9 are even in size and weight with the baton markers. I have noticed that Rolex is particular about having evenly illuminated numbers, baton markers, and hands. To have luminous paint even in size to those of the markers, the numbers on the dial would have to absolutely be bigger, which would have ruined the balance of the iconic dial. So Rolex opted not to apply luminous paint instead of having relatively weaker lume on the numbers, which just wouldn't look professional like typical Rolex style. In the early 2000s, Rolex started transitioning to a bolder design aesthetic, like the Datejust 116200, the maxi case on the Submariner and the GMTs, and in 2010 with the introduction with the less modestly sized 39mm Explorer 214270. The styling evolution of the product line justified larger markers, batons, and with that, it was finally possible to apply enough of the new Chromolite luminous paint into the newly designed number markers to achieve bright, even lume between the hands, numbers, and batons. To maintain the balance and unity, the font also had to grow in size, as well as the relative width of the bezel, the lug thicknesses, and so on and so forth. So it was kind of like a domino effect that wasn't appropriate until the bolder design direction of the times. So my 114270 has some design holdovers reminiscent of the 5-digit Rolex era, similar to those of the 14060 no-date sub, which retained its drilled lugs and hollow end links, while its brother models got all new features. I personally connect more with the design aspects of the 114270. It's all relative to each's personal, unique watch journey. The dial layout. Fans of the Explorer have been trying for a while now to explain why the dial is so mesmerizing and perfectly designed. Here's my humble observations about this dial, especially with regard to the layout of the numbers. As opposed to, say, the Omega Railmaster and Ranchero, and even the Tudor Ranger, the Explorer has no 12 marker, just 3, 6, and 9. If you look at these digits, they are all double-lobed numerals, basically variations of the figure 8. This is accentuated by the more modern font on all the post-1016 models of the Explorer. I think that this is one of the secret reasons that our eyes find this dial so aesthetically pleasing and balanced. Notice the visual balance of the 3, 6, and 9. I'm not saying it's ruined by the vastly different 12 on the Railmaster and Ranchero, but it's a different look. 12 is a very unsymmetrical marker, and the very subtle differences in the design of the actual symbols of the Arabic numbers are slight, just barely enough to create some interest, but not too much to interrupt the balance and symmetry of the dial. Just imagine if you were from a different planet and seeing our Arabic number system for the first time, and were inspecting this thing called a wristwatch. At first, you might not notice the subtle differences between the digits 3, 6, and 9 until you look really close. It would be like, hey, there's actually a little difference here. Maybe it's more than just a cool design, but some kind of symbol trying to communicate something. And now some thoughts on date versus no date watches. I used to be a date window guy, incapable of imagining wearing a watch without a date. The first time I took notice of the Explorer model, I remember it was on the wrist of a fellow passenger on an airline flight. I naively thought to myself, it's just a Datejust without a date window and less elegant hands and a dial. Duh, little did I know.
We mock what we don't understand. Yeah.
When I started getting interested in the Explorer, I saw this one customized Datejust and thought it was the coolest thing and the perfect watch. But then I started to appreciate the visual balance and aesthetics of a no-date dial. But also, as far as function goes, on watches you don't wear every day, I think a date feature can get you into trouble. More than a few times have I forgotten to advance the date at the end of a month with less than 31 days, or messed up the AM/PM when setting a watch, and so I'm just not as trusting of a date function on watches these days. But there's also a little bit of psychology about having a date watch versus a no-date watch. Having a date on the dial can be a constant reminder of certain deadlines, appointments, or other commitments. This takes me out of the present moment, and I find it a distraction. Whereas with a no-date watch, it keeps me more grounded in the present day. Maybe not present moment, but at least the present day, and I personally find that a little bit less stressful. Finally, on the subject of automatic versus manual wound watches, I've mentioned before how much I love the act of winding a manual watch. I also love how they allow the watch case to be slimmer since there's no rotor. But there is something to be said for the convenience of an automatic watch. Putting it on your wrist without having to wind it is its own kind of joyful ritual, and although I generally prefer the manual wound experience, an automatic does have its subtle caveats. A manual wound watch usually employs a push-pull type of winding crown to simplify the manual winding procedure. But without a screw-down crown, the water resistance is significantly diminished, and for a daily wearer, this can be a compromise. There are some screw-down manual winders, but it's a minor hassle having to first unscrew the crown like I had to do with my Serica that I reviewed. And yes, if you want to give your automatic watch a wind once in a while, you can certainly do so after unsecuring the screw-down crown. So there it is, you live and you learn. And if you're interested in learning how this particular Explorer became my favorite Rolex, check out this video here. Thanks for watching and have a great day.